Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Really excited about this event. For those of you who have been in Lighthouse events before, this is our space for introspection as a field, as a community, to bring in voices who have been leading the discourse around science-informed design, around conscious design, or generally around the relationship between people and place. And we have Lighthouse Fellows who come in and give us their wisdom and allow us to ask them questions and maybe ask them to ask questions as well, to get us to open up our thinking, to be critical about who we are as a community of practice, and to see where the challenges lie ahead for how we develop, and also see the opportunities that come from their work. And I'm really excited to have Sam with us, and we're really grateful for you to come and spend your time with us. A lot of you have read his book. I will give a very kind of short introduction to Sam, which is one of these dry things that people could read out the bio. But just for anyone who doesn't have those details about Sam. Sam is a professor of psychology at University of Texas at Austin. He's known for his work on how personality is expressed in everyday environments. His research takes ecological approach, studying people in their natural habitats, and increasingly informs architectural practice, which we'll get to. He's also the author of Snoop, What Your Stuff Says About You, which explores how we consciously and unconsciously express ourselves through the spaces we inhabit. I may be ashamed to admit that I think a lot of people read this book way before me. And I read it in the last few months, and I wish I had done before, because I found myself every couple of pages stopping the reading and staring out into space and kind of wondering about what this all means for what we've been doing in the last 10 years in conscious design, and what kind of questions it raises. And it raises a lot of good questions, which I hope we'll be delving into in the next hour. We have an hour of conversation with Sam, and then we'll open up to questions, first of all, from some of our other fellows in the same cohort, and then to others in the audience. Just to thank you for everyone who has joined us and who supports us as a member. This is what helps us keep on doing our work. And our work is, as you might already know, to support you and the field and help us grow as a community. So to begin with, I just want to I started saying what the kind of thoughts I was having when I was reading the book. I think it raises a lot of questions about what we tend to promise as designers informing our decisions with science. What is it that we can actually claim to be doing in informing design, and some of the challenges that it raises when it comes to how much can we know about the people we're designing for? What do these people know about themselves? And how does that all add up to making an effective design to improve people's well-being for whatever we are designing for? So before we dive in, hello, Sam.
Hello.
It'd be great to hear a little bit from you, just a short introduction about what interests you about this field where science intersects with design, how you got interested in the research that you're doing, and kind of a general comment about, what you hope to talk about in this session.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me here, Itai. I think I actually kind of got into this question of the connection between people and the places in which they dwell, kind of in a odd sideways way. So as you mentioned briefly, there are certain issues with self-reports and how well people know themselves. And one of the ways that people have thought to looking into that, saying, okay, well, if I was to ask you, how many times have you interrupted somebody in the past day, you probably wouldn't have much of an idea about how that is, or even pretty basic things, how many times you went into the kitchen. So I was just, this was when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. I was thinking, how can are there other ways of being able to understand what people are really like? Why don't we do what detectives do? Instead of asking people about their lives, looking for evidence in their spaces. If we go into somebody's space and there's a kind of an unpaid parking ticket, strewn around the floor, that tells you about a kind of behavioral sequence, a likely behavioral sequence that made the place end up like that, and therefore you can reason back from what actions were associated with that, and therefore potentially what they were like. So that was kind of why I thought, okay, well, maybe we can learn about people's actions, their behaviors, by going into their spaces. And so we created a study where we sent a bunch of research assistants into the living spaces of strangers and asked them to try to guess what they were like. And it was when I was in those spaces that I think that there's kind of the connections, the different ways in which we relate to the spaces, how we may change the spaces, how those spaces may change us, kind of dawned on me. And I began to realize how sort of psychologically rich these various connections were between people and the places in which they dwell. And kind of that was the kind of leaping off point. And then from there, I went on to look at all kinds of other types of environments, kind of, the sorts of music people listen to, the neighborhoods people live in, the cafes they go to, those kinds of things, how we affect and select, manipulate the spaces around us.
Mm. And when you were doing this research, or at least when you began to be curious about this, did you have any intention of it being used in design? Did you see the relevance of it in design?
No, I didn't. It was a long time before I, had that thought. I was really just interested in the psychology of it, of how, because it seemed there's so much going on here. And actually, it was a research assistant of mine who alerted me to the fact that the architectural education didn't really require any systematic education in psychology or really understanding humans. I guess I had just assumed they would, and this research assistant alerted me to it, and I thought, okay, this explains, I think, sometimes why it seems that partially explains why it seems that spaces don't always seem very human in some ways.
And okay, so probably after you wrote the book, and now that I've seen you in a few events of, where science meets design and so on, you've been having conversations with designers, and you've probably had some collaborations with designers. How does that go? How does that conversation go? And what do people what assumptions do designers come with into the conversations with you? And where do you feel you need to correct course some of the time, or direct them to other knowledge or to research to kind of get them into the same thinking that you're coming from?
Yeah, I think actually that those little differences between disciplines end up having incredibly big impacts in terms of providing obstacles to the scientific and the academic and scientific disciplines really working well with the design groups. But it goes both ways, because we all, when I first, I think it was in 2009, I organized was it that long ago? I'm not sure. Anyway, a conference on psychology and architecture where we brought psychologists and architects together. And when I first spoke to, and we were organizing it with some members of the architecture school, and one of the architects there said to me, it was a kind of a joke. They said, "Oh well, if you better make sure you have a good font or none of the architects will listen to you. And we all went, ha, 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 ha. But then it was actually like about a year later or something like that. I was going to give a talk in an architecture firm, and I sent them my slides ahead, and I was just about to go on and give my talk. And before I did, one of the architects who had been the person who received the presentation and had kind of prepared it, whispered into my ear, she goes, "Don't worry, Sam, I changed your font for you. It looks good now." So it's like, they really, it's kind of ha ha ha, but it's actually serious. But we psychologists and behavioral scientists, we have our own triggers which will stop communication. If I'm sitting in a talk and somebody comes in and says, "Yeah, well, I don't have any data, but blah blah blah," I think, okay, well, this is worthless. I don't need, I can switch off now, and that itself is just as big a problem. So there's these silly little kind of practices that each of these areas engage in that really stand in the way. It's possible that somebody with poor font has something that's worthwhile for architects to listen to. It is possible that someone without data has something that's important for researchers to hear too. So, those were the kinds of, very basic obstacles I got into. But I think and it's been interesting talking to people in the design professions. I think some see this kind of a work that that you and many others, and probably most of the people here, are doing as pretty subversive, and can get. So I've experienced quite a lot of defensiveness in some of the people I speak to. I've experienced quite a lot of people who are just uninterested and think this is completely irrelevant. Some people think it's subversive, and then there's another. I don't know what the proportions are. Probably people in this group would have a better sense than me. And then some people who kind of think, maybe there's something there, and then we try to work together. And I have to say, that too has kind of revealed a number of kind of challenges that I think are really standing in the way of the types of progress that everyone on this call is hoping to make. One of the and I think part of the reason is that the sciences and the way I do my studies and where I've been doing my research until very recently has all been oriented towards my incentive structure, which is publishing articles in scientific journals that other people like me will think is good. It's not publishing something that is of interest that's going to help people build better places or design better places. It's not oriented that way at all. And the consequence is that we, scientists and social scientists, are doing lots and lots of data. We're writing all of these papers and we're kind of producing, and it's all going into the journals. But it's not in a way that is useful to you. And this was kind of really summed up in a sentence that one of my collaborators, an architect we were trying to work with, said. He says, "When I read the psychology journals, I see a lot of answers to questions I don't have." And he's right. He's right. They're full. The journals are full. But I doubt you could look through, the 10 top perception journals. Sure, perception is really important, right, to how you experience spaces. You could read through, a year of the top 10 perception journals, and I doubt there would be a single article in there that would really help a designer in practice do something differently than they would otherwise, because it's not oriented towards them. And I think that's a really big challenge. And just to finish that thought, what I've been trying to do since I've started engaging with people in the design professions is trying to package what I do in ways that might be more helpful.
I have so a few kind of things that pop whilst you were speaking, to connect this thing of the architects being obsessed with the font and the aesthetics and you needing data in order to want to listen to someone. I think that really connects well with what you're talking about as incentives, because if your incentive is, as a researcher, is for data because that's what you can publish, and if the incentive of the architect or the designer is to create things that are aesthetically appealing because that is how their skill is judged, then I think that creates this kind of challenge of how do you speak the same language that is motivated by the same incentives, right? So have you come across, I mean, there are collaborations between scientists and architects where you might find an architect has a project in which data can be gathered and the scientist is interested in it, or that there is a real world application of the science in the design decisions. So have you had experiences of something that you would call a good example where your motivation and the motivation of the designer have aligned better?
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, I through the work that I personally have done with architects, we've never really actually gotten through to completion. We've had so many full starts where the client has said, yes, we'd love to incorporate some of this work or some of these ideas, but then at somewhere along the line, it's like, oh, we don't have time for this, we don't have funds for this. The client is no longer wants to be involved with this, and so on. And so I think it's, yeah, and I think, that I think that's, really one of the challenges for the whole field is how can we kind of systematically integrate this, work that would be useful to broader groups. Now there is a whole set of data that is sort of tantalizingly, close, but not there, which is all the sort of the post-occupancy evaluation world. So it's, when I first started hearing about post-occupancy evaluations, I know only a subset of people do it and so on, but nonetheless, there are a lot of post-occupancy evaluations out there in the world. When I first heard about that, I thought, oh wow, this could be really useful data. However, the more I learn about it, the more I understand, well, okay, it's not really administered or organized or stored or indexed in a way that would, where we can do much more, analyze it in a way that would be generalizable. Because I think, if there was, a post-occupancy evaluation such that there was a standard set of dimensions or questions that were answered in all of them, plus the extra ones that were specific to the project, then you'd begin to be able, to collect large quantities of data across many of the things that we think are important, like across cultures and across nations, and we begin to be able to have the kind of the scale of data that might be useful just for beginning to understand the sorts of things that are contribute to the sorts of criteria that you talked about in terms of health and well-being and sense of community and productivity, whatever it is you want to meet.
So, okay. I think something that we often talk about from the beginning as a field was what is the value proposition of what we're saying? What is it that we're offering which you wouldn't be able to get from an architect who wasn't informing their design through science? And I don't think this is something that we can necessarily ask here, but it is, I think, the crux of the question here of the value needs to be an incentive that works both for researchers, but both for designers. And I think this is a good kind of segue for us to talk about your work and what it means for whether it can be applied, or what we can promise, or what we can or what we can't promise, what the value of this knowledge is. So just for everyone in the room, if you could describe the research that you did and the kind of knowledge that you feel was created that is relevant for these kind of conversations.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, my background is in personality psychology. So I'm interested in how individuals differ consistently, and I was particularly interested, once I started this work, in how that those individual differences, how those personality characteristics might get expressed either deliberately or inadvertently, as you said earlier, in our spaces, and I think it's potentially. I mean, the broader issue is that Bill, in terms of getting back to your idea of the value proposition, is that I think probably everyone on this call agrees that spaces do have some kind of impact on the people in them. I mean, that seems almost so fundamental and rudimentary that it isn't worth saying. But it is also remarkable that, given we all agree on that, how little systematic research is done on that question in architecture schools. So I'm interested in how individuals express themselves, and we've done our research, as I said, by essentially looking at places themselves, trying to understand what are places like, what are the features in those spaces, how disorganized are they, what are the items in there, and so on. What are the kinds of broader, are they messy, are they clean, are they smelly, are they modern, are they old? Anyway, various kinds of things, trying to understand, what those spaces are like, which itself is, of course, a huge problem. How do you measure what a space is like in some kind of systematic and reliable way? And then trying to get what we did in our first studies was get the impressions of people who went into those spaces, and then try to get some index of what the occupants who lived in those spaces were really like. And what we found was that some personality dimensions do tend to show up quite strongly in people's spaces. So by that, I mean the impressions of people who go into these spaces correlate pretty strongly with the personalities of the people who occupy those spaces. And even if those impressions were wrong, what we find is that the features of those spaces correlate pretty strongly with the people who occupy them. And we've kind of proposed essentially that there's these sort of three broad mechanisms by which people affect their spaces. So the first is what we call a kind of identity claim. So identity claims are deliberate statements we make about ourselves, who we are. We broadcast these to others. And we do that in all kinds of contexts. We do that with the clothes we're wearing. If you wear your university or your sports team or your certain brands or whatever it is, you are saying to others in a very explicit and deliberate way, hey, other people, this is who I am, and I want you to know about it. I mean, it's a deliberate thing we do. And I think so a lot of the things we do in our places, especially the places that are more public, where we're expecting other people to be, are about sending those signals to others. And I think, one of the kind of questions people often have when you think about those signals is, well, are they deceptive or kind of manipulative things? Are people trying to create a false impression? I think, there are contexts in which we may be trying to inflate ourselves, perhaps like, on a date or in a job interview or various, situations where we are trying to create a false impression. But I think research has shown that generally people want to be seen as they see themselves. Even people, this is work from Bill Swan on his self-verification theory. He's shown that even people who see themselves negatively prefer it when others see them negatively too. It makes them feel more, what he calls verified. So a lot of what we're doing is essentially trying to send signals out to the world to bring other people's impressions of us into line with our own impressions, because that makes the world feel more predictable for us. It feels like we understand how things are going to go and so on. So that's one way, these sort of identity claims. Another way, the second way I think we affect our spaces is when we are trying what I've called thought and feeling regulators. So lots of the things we do are about trying to make us feel a certain way or think about a certain thing. So, perhaps the most obvious examples are the music we play, right? We play certain music to relax. We play a different side of music to kind of get pumped up before a night on the town. We play different music when we are having friends around. We want them to mingle. So that music's another example. Another example is probably if you look at the background of your computer or the photo on your phone, right? That is probably a photo, an image of a special person, a special place, a special time, or something like that. Why is that? You're using that to try to affect your thoughts and feelings. Oh, you look at the phone, you see a kid, you think, oh, there's my kid, and that essentially makes you feel a certain way. And that's what we do with a lot of the elements in our space too. They're put there deliberately, but then the goal is not to send a signal, it's to affect our own thoughts and feelings. And of course, there is some bleeding between these things. I'm making out these different processes to be cleaner than they would be in reality. And then I think the third way is what I call behavioral residue. And this is the idea that we engage in actions all the time, and a subset of those our actions, not all of them, but a subset of our actions leave a material trace in their wake. So that would be the disorganized book collection, or the chaotic, or the very neat tidy place, right? A place is organized and tidy because of things that somebody did. Those are a material trace of that behavior. And of course, there's traces of behaviors done elsewhere. You have muddy hiking boots, or skis, or something like that, or a dog leash. There's also evidence of behaviors you might do outside that space too. And I think so there are these strong links between people and the spaces in which they live, and that is why they turn out to be such a helpful way of learning about people, and a way that's actually quite hard to manipulate. It's quite hard, I think, to give a truly false impression from the places in which you live. Which, I think there are a few reasons for that, which I'd be happy to talk about if you want to, but perhaps you want to move on to something else. I'm not sure.
No, I do want to talk about it, because I think when I was reading about this research, it really stopped me in my tracks, because I think it goes against a lot of what we think about in science-informed design and what we think we can do. I think specifically what you talk about, the less so the thoughts and feelings regulators, but the behavioral residue and the identity claims, for me, create this really interesting tension, which is that often design is an aspirational act. You design because you want to change the reality, you want to change your habits, you want to change your environment in order to affect your life in some way. We don't necessarily think of design as something that is taking an environment and completely attuning it to what's already there in your personality. But what it seems from your research is that the aspirational aspect of design is really quite limited, because the identity and the behaviors seep out, the honesty of it seeps out into the spaces, right? And so I think as a designer, you can have a client that says to you, they might come and honestly say to you, I'm not tidy, I'm neurotic, I'm whatever, this and this, and they might be self-aware enough and honest enough to say that. And And then the question is, okay, so is that what I'm designing for? Am I designing for you to stay static exactly as you are? Or is there some kind of aspiration in what we're trying to do here? And I'd love you to talk a bit about the limitations of designing for aspirations. You know, how much can we design to shape ourselves? Because that is really the premise of a lot of conscious design. It's the premise behind conscious cities and the philosophy behind it from David Harvey or from Lefebvre, which says, you know, we have our environment to shape and therefore to shape ourselves through it. And this kind of throws a spanner in the works. And it's an interesting, you know, in a way, it's kind of, okay, maybe we should ignore this, but we shouldn't ignore it at all, because if it should help us align to being more realistic about what we can do. So if you could
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
address those limitations in how you see them.
Yeah, I think so, and I think, you know, maybe shape isn't such a bad word, but you know, change, you know, is substantial. You know, there's you could move things a little, but changing is quite difficult. You know, we know that from, and here I'm talking mainly about personality traits. There are other elements to personality too, which we can get into, but personality traits. And, you know, and the research is, you know, pretty clear here after all these years, is that our personality traits have a pretty strong genetic component. And, you know, so kind of the way I think about it is in terms of our personalities is, you know, you can imagine, you know, there's a kind of, you know, a 10-point scale, is it introversion here and extroversion up here. And, you know, and your genes are going to put you kind of in a range somewhere here. So, you know, and you can move within that range, but it's very hard for you to move out of that kind of genetically predisposed range. Now, does that mean you can't change your behavior? No, of course, but people do. So, for example, you know, I think we understand that for men, you know, especially in perhaps work context, organizational context, and others, that it helps to be extroverted. There is an advantage that extroverts enjoy in many contexts, and so many people understand that. And they understand, okay, even the introverts say, okay, well, I need to behave in a more extroverted way. And introverts can indeed train themselves to behave in a more extroverted way, and they will behave in a more extroverted way, but they will never experience a party the way an extrovert experiences a party. So, like, if you know, and that's the difference, is it behavior. You could send a true extrovert into a party, and you could send an introvert behaving like an extrovert into a party, and on the outside they may look pretty similar. But really, in terms of the cost afterwards, is very different. At the end of the party, the extrovert has their batteries charged. They're like, that was great. That was a fantastic party. My batteries are ready. Where's the next party? You know, they want to go on to the next one. Whereas the introvert, they're like, oh, all right, that I am done. I am exhausted. My batteries are drained. I'm going to go and lock myself in the bathroom for a while, so where no one can find me. So I think, you know, we can affect our behaviors, and sometimes it's useful to do, and sometimes the design elements can help us do that. So we might, you know, be able to kind of create, like, if you want to become more organized, you know, the facilities that allow somebody to become more organized. But if they're not really that way, they just will tend not to get. I mean, this is true for me. Like, you know, this, you know, like I was tired of having my records, all, you know, in a chaotic area. So I got, you know, a whole bunch of record shelves, and, you know, I thought, okay, I can alphabetize all of these, and I alphabetized them. But, you know, after a few weeks, the order is gone again, because I don't live like that. It's persistently doing something time after time after time. Now, but sometimes it does work. So, for example, you know, I'm a pretty forgetful person, but I want to have, but I want to remember things, so I write them down. And the meaningful unit that you are dealing with is me and my calendar. So when I show up to time, on time for this interview, you don't know if it was me or if it's my calendar or both. It doesn't really matter to you. But it was, the me and my extended self of the calendar is a pretty conscientious person in terms of with respect to, meeting appointments and so on. But other things, it's quite difficult, and it's quite difficult to fake those things because one of the reasons is personality is not only what we do and how we feel, it's also how we perceive the world. I remember I was co-teaching with another teacher once, and in the course of talking about this kind of stuff, I said, well, my office is quite a mess. And the teacher next to me said, what are you talking about? No, it's not. It's incredibly neat. So we took the whole class up to my office and said, okay, tell us, is this office tidy or not tidy or so on? And, as you might expect, about a third of the class thought it was very messy, a third thought it was about right, and a third thought it was, very tidy. And that's because, I don't see the things that a conscientious person would do. You could come into my office and you could, mess up the books and I wouldn't notice for a while. Whereas if you went into my colleague's, a different colleague, not this one who I was just talking about, a different colleague office, my colleague Cindy Messon, super organized. I could go into her office and I could turn some of the pencils upside down and she would notice it right away. Right. So it's those differences that are that you can't change through, design. You can't make those differences appear. And of course, it is those differences in perception that drive the differences in behavior. Somebody who's very, very worried about being late and very worried about running out of sharpened pencils will have a different space and a different sets of behavior than somebody who's not even thinking about those things.
It makes me think of, there's this aspect of when people think about self-improvement, or just like the cliche of you have to be challenged or be in discomfort in order to develop. Does that mean that the way we design our spaces has to take that into account in thinking about aspirations? If someone does say to you, okay, I do want to be tidier, or I do want to invite people more often, even though I'm an introvert, if we design for who they are and we completely align to what they're doing, then we're not creating the friction that they would require for their aspirations. So, in some ways, some people would say creating that friction is a failure of design. So there's a whole web here of what is possible to aspire to. Do we design for people's existing personality? Do we design for what they want to become? And I think we're not going to have the answers from this conversation, but I think these raise some really, really critical questions for us as a field.
I think at the work, just to pick up on an example of that. So one of the I have a whole chapter about him in my book, and one of the people I talk a lot about is this architect called Christopher Travis, who I think is one of the people who for a long time has really been sort of deeply integrating psychology in a meaningful and practical way into his architectural practice. And sort of one of the examples he gives is, he has a whole series of 50 different exercises he gets people to go through before he'll even pick up a pencil and start drawing at all. But one of the things he says, well, what is, if he's building for a family or a couple or something like that, he says, well, we're essentially trying to design a life, design a life that these people want, and we're going to try to create a built space that is going to facilitate that life. So one of the examples he gave to me was, one of his exercises is, hey, what are the things that really annoy you about your mates? What are the things that your mate does, or you and your mate do, that really actually help you, make your relationship better? And so using those exercises and say, okay, so and so one example of one that the couples gave was, well, what really annoys me is all I ask of my husband is that he puts the lid back on the toothpaste tube afterwards. And the fact that he doesn't do this means that he doesn't respect me as a person, and blah, blah, and so you're off to the races with where you got, okay, all right, just obviously build them two sinks, so you can have the toothpaste tube without the sink on one hand and the other one here, but essentially not trying to change them. It's trying to, in this case, understand who they are and integrate that into the design process in a way that's not going to expect unrealistic changes. He's never going to become a person who puts the toothpaste on the toothpaste tube, so let's immediately dissolve that thing. The example they gave about was the couple and say, hey, well, in the mornings, before we had kids, we always used to have this kind of special time together where we would have coffee in the morning, and that would be our time to connect with each other and find out what's going on in each other's lives before we, went off to our jobs and so on. But now our lives are so busy, we have kids and so on, that's all gone. So his solution was, okay, let's accept what is going on in this life and design around it. So he built a coffee bar in their bedroom so they could get up, have coffee together before kids and other things had kind of, ruined it all and made that not possible. Create that, and of course, once you have the coffee bar there, that affects the orientation of, well, they want to have a place where they can look out, have a view from that, and that affects the building and all these kinds of things. So, essentially, what I think, where this is helpful and potentially helpful in the design context is, look, I'm sure, all architects, given those bits of information, could use those bits of information and integrate it into a good design that works well for these people. But unless you are asking the right questions in the first place, what are the things that help your relationship? What are the things that get in the way of your relationship? Unless you ask those things, you're not going to get the realistic information about these people that is going to help you build a place that helps them meet the needs you're intending to.
So, okay, the first thing that kind of pops into my mind is as soon as you start talking about how a space mediates between people rather than to a specific, how it is for a specific individual, it becomes much more fertile ground, because as a mediator, then we can say, okay, there is a lot of value. Rather than looking at aspiration, it's about who shares this space and what do we know about them, and how can that space mediate their lives in a way that's good for them. Now, one of the things that stood out to me in your research was the fact that people were not very good at understanding what their spaces were projecting, and perhaps not very good at describing themselves. And I think self-awareness is an issue that we have in a society in general, and that is challenging when you talk about a kind of design that says the designer first of all needs to get to know the person and tease out or ask questions about how they live their lives and who they are. Now, when you have that as a responsibility as a designer, but your source of information is either not self-aware or unable to express how they are, your research suggests that we have a lot more honest information to gather from actually looking at the spaces that they inhabit rather than asking them or speaking to them. And so what do you think that means for the way designers speak to clients, the way we create our briefs, those initial conversations when we speak to people and try and tease out that information? Where are the challenges and what are the opportunities in that point of the process?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, to the extent that you want to know what the people are like, and and I think that has been perhaps one of the, the problems, is that much, I think design in the past has not really been too focused on what the occupants are going to be like. Whether yeah. Well, let's just leave it at that. So, to the extent you want to know, then you'll want to get the best sources of information about that. And the problem with that is it's complex, because there are some things for which the self is the best judge. So this is work actually by Samin Vazir, who has developed what she's called the FOCA model, the self what's it, the self other knowledge asymmetry, saying that there are some things that are better where we are a better judge. So things that have very low observability, like your worries, your anxieties, and if I want to know if you're hungry, you're the best person to tell me about that. But also, you'd be the best person to tell me about your anxieties and the sorts of things you're worried about, because those are really all going on inside your head. So for some things, the self is a good judge, but for many things, especially things that are high in evaluativeness, the research has shown that other individuals, other people who know you well, are better at predicting things. So things, like, and especially if they're not too evaluative, something like extroversion, those sorts of things. Others are better at judging, especially when done under conditions where their judgment, if they know that what they say is going to, be kept private, and those sorts of things. So in terms of, so essentially there is no one source that is best for everything to learn about a person. And I would suggest that, our research shows that in fact, looking at people's living spaces is one of the best places for learning about what they're like. And one of the main reasons is the reason I said before, is that our personality affects how we see things. And that's very hard to change. I could never get to a place where I noticed that the two pencils have been turned over. And then the second reason is that essentially, a space consists of many, many behaviors which have been crystallized over, many, 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 the objects, the way the objects are, right? My record collection gets to be the way it is because of repeated behaviors. And that's not something I can just suddenly change. So I think it's the fact that we're not really aware of it, and that we're doing something over and over and over and over and again, which makes it pretty hard to provide something that's very fake. So I think, but I think it's also important to know that even so, which gets back to your question of aspirations, and it gets back to this question I mentioned of Bill Swann's self-verification theory. It's also, even if somebody is wrong about themselves, it's also sometimes worth knowing what they think, even if they are mistaken, because if they are trying to, it's important to them to be verified, to portray themselves in a certain way. That is a valid criteria too. Because if you accept that part of the role of a space is to convey a certain personality or image or something like that.
So, when we talk about changing our ways of designing, a lot of the conversation that we have is about the agency of the person who is going to live in that space, the agency to change their own environment and so on. What you're raising is kind of interesting for this facet of the conversation, because if you're saying that from the outside we are able to perceive things that others aren't able to perceive in themselves, so we might see something in the person's living space that they might not be able to see, and our responsibility is to design for comfort or to design for what they're aspiring to be. We return to something that we raise as an issue as a field, which is, does the designer paternalize the client? Or do we become a medium for them to express their desires and aspirations, and we're just there to connect their intention to what gets built? So the idea of what is the role of the architect and the designer, whether they are prescriptive, it raises this question, because in some ways what you're saying is that, yeah, someone from the outside might know better. And that brings us back to the designer being paternalistic in a way to the client. So how do you, what do you think about that relationship?
Yeah, I think it's true. I mean, I think in some ways, it may be. It may be that you are able to. You may have to at least adjust your. When somebody says something about themselves, you may be able to say, okay, well, that doesn't seem to be accurate, or it seems to be exaggerated, or something like that, and take that into account. And so I suppose, yeah, you may not believe them, but I think that going back to the work that Christopher Travis does is what he does in his work is he doesn't ask people what they want. He says, because people will think they know what they want and will make them happy, but they are often mistaken about that. And I mean, the designers on this call may relate to this. Chris Travis says, he would get people's preferences, and then he would design a house for them, and then they'd want to change again. And he spent most of this time in redesign. And so he would insist that his clients went through this process where he's not asking them what they want, but he is respecting them. He's saying, look, you do have inside you the knowledge that will allow me to build a place that will fit you well. So, one of the examples he gives, and you may not buy the theory, or you may, I don't know, but, his theory is that many of our conceptions of home and what a place that feels comfortable and feels like home come from our early experiences of feeling safe and provided for and feeling loved. And so when he starts out his process, he asks his clients, he doesn't say, tell me what kind of building you want, what other buildings you like, or what materials you like. He says, tell me about a time in your life when you felt really loved. Tell me about it. No mention of a building at all. Tell me about a time in your life when you felt provided for, when you felt protected. And people say, oh, I remember the time when, when I was 6 years old and running up the driveway to, my grandparents' home, and the feel of the warm gravel on my feet. And okay, then you begins to extract architectural features, the warm gravel on the feet, that will help evoke those kinds of feelings of feeling loved and protected and provided, those sorts of things. So essentially he's saying, look, the information is there, but asking them, what do you want in a building, in your build, whatever it is I'm building for you, is not the right way to do it. So in a way, that is paternalistic, saying I'm not going to believe what you say, but humans are known to be bad for knowing what will make us happy. There's this whole area of research in mating, where there's research done by Paul Eastwick, where he will ask people, he says, tell me the characteristics of your ideal mate. What is it you ideally want in a mate? And then he goes back to them 2 years later and finds out if they're in a relationship, and then gets the characteristics of their mate, and then sees how closely does their mate actually match the things they said would be their ideal, they had previously said would be their ideal mate, and the degree to which those two things match, right? In theory, that should predict relationship satisfaction if the person had insight into the things that would make them happy, but it's completely unrelated. There's a zero correlation. People are, are not, are not, the things they think will make them happy in a mate are unrelated to the things that actually make them happy in a mate. So we're known to be not very good at predicting the things that will work for us. That's, it's a widely known finding.
Yeah. I mean, when people think about whether they want to go to therapy, then, obviously someone needs to want to go through a process in order for
Yeah.
that therapy to be effective. And it seems that, what you're saying is kind of similar to for designers. If people don't want to introspect and meet themselves and kind of go into the depths of who they are, then the conversation with the designer, if this is the way we're talking about design, isn't going to succeed. And so it kind of makes me think that there is even, when someone first meets a therapist, there's this kind of goal setting, role setting conversation that isn't really something that an architect or designer has with the client in the beginning, because the roles seem to be very clear historically, right? There's this specific role, and so I wonder if it would be useful for designers like ourselves to understand what is that very first meeting point where you frame the roles within this conversation, so that the designer doesn't seem paternalistic, so that the client can be comfortable with opening up those specific things.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of contract, in a way, that needs to be created in order for the sides to have enough trust that the architect may say things that seem not intuitive to the client, maybe against what they think they need. But how do you create that trust is a question. And I think often when we translate science into design decisions, the onus is on us to tell the person looking at those decisions to say why we arrived at them. And from your work, and I think what's interesting about your work is it raises all the questions that allows us to think of how do we describe to the person in front of us what our intention is. How do we make our intention transparent to them so that there's a level of trust, right? And I think that requires a real scaffolding, which I'm not sure that exists right now for the field.
I mean, I think,
go.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've said this before in a slightly different context. Is I think, the role of, the role of the designer or the architect is would be more effective if it was if the role was more like a nurse. It's like, hey, how can I use my skills to help you, not from a paternalistic kind of perspective, but like, what do I know that's going to help you get to to where you want to be. I suppose he's trying to solve the same problem. The way Travis does this in the beginning of his interviews is he spends a lot of time saying, what are your fears about architects? What are your, what do you think about builders? What do you think about all these things? To try to get them out in the open, to try to, hey, let's talk about this. Let's directly address this relationship and what's going on, to try to get beyond that kind of thing. I mean, I hesitate to talk about it because I haven't done research on it, so I don't know if it works. But it's I think it's certainly congruent with what you're saying.
I think this is a very good point to open up to the other people who have probably had these challenges, these kind of conversations with their clients, these questions about their role and so on. Before we do that, we have a tradition of asking Lighthouse fellows to pose a question to the community, to the CCD, and to the conscious design community. So what would that question be from you?
The question would, and it would be based on this idea that I think, you know, all of us understand that there's research going on that has been done in my field and others, and that sounds potentially helpful to the design world, but the thing that's really missing is we never know the generalizability of these findings, if they'll apply to different communities, if they will, you know, to apply in different circumstances and so on. So the question is really is what, you know, what conditions can we create where research can be integrated into practice? Is there even a set of conditions where we can kind of bring these two things together? You know, whether that's changing norms, changing incentives. I don't know what it is, but how can we allow, you know, a design project to also become a research project so we can feedback and make it better in the end?
So that really goes back to kind of the first thing you were saying, which was, you know, the incentive that the designer comes into the process, and incentive that a researcher would come into the process. Yeah. Great. So thank you so far, and I'm excited to see what other people are thinking and how they're experiencing this conversation. We give first dibs to our fellows to ask a question, and I know Lucas wanted to ask one. In the meantime, whilst we were speaking, it became dark here, so I'm going to go and turn the light on in my room. And Lucas, if you want to open up your mic and pose your question.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for a very inspiring conversation. It was really wonderful to listen to you. As I said, I've read your book a long time ago, and I remember that I read it while I was working as an architect, and I also had a role as a coach at an architectural office, which was very interesting because it was about supporting people, and then I could immediately kind of reflect on your book while I talked to people and worked on architecture, not for them, but for somebody else. I think that there's a very deep potential in working with individuals, whether you work on their homes and offices or anything else, and their personal traits. And some of us who maybe went to therapy once in life, they know that it's a very demanding process, and that there's a lot of responsibility, and that it can reveal a trauma or something like that. And I really can't imagine that I, as an architect, would ever handle this going too deep. So my question is, how do you think, how deep we should go? And if we probably should work with a psychologist during the process? Do you have experience of working with architects hands-on in a project? And do you have any reflection about that?
I think that's a really great question, and I think, you know, it kind of, you know, requires us to ask the question of, you know, of how deep and how big a change do we really want to make it, you know, with architects, you know, how deeply do we want to get into it? Because I think that a lot of incredibly difficult and challenging thoughts and emotions can come up in this context. I've seen it even with Christopher Travis's work. I have seen some people become very affected by it. And in fact, he does recommend working with a therapist too in consultation with it, so you have a professional. Because I think it's partly, do you want to get in there? Do you want to? And if you do, then I think working with a professional in that context would be good. Now, I haven't done that too, and indeed I'm not even qualified to. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm just an experimental psychologist, so wouldn't be qualified to do so. But I think yeah, if you are going to go deep, you need one of two things. You either need to have the psychologist as part of the process, and I think that could be incredibly helpful, or like some guardrails which built into the kinds of exercises you're going to do. And I think that's why having a kind of standardized set of exercises is potentially quite helpful, because that will provide some guard against a non-professional kind of veering off into a place they can't get out of, or don't know what to do.
Thank you. I've always been imagining the future of architects working alongside with psychologists. Actually, that's.
I think that absolutely. I mean, it's if we're going to recognize, I probably, I mean, this call is the exact universe of people who don't need to hear this. But if we're going to recognize the impact of space and how important and how deep it is, then let's do that. Let's get in there and really get in there, and that involves rethinking about how lots of things are done. Going all the way back to the education of architectural education, and who becomes an architect, how they're trained, how all of this, and also provide enormous helpful, I think, opportunities where therapists can do work and be integrated into this. I think it's an area with huge potential if we're going to really commit to saying this is important and this is where good work can be done in making people's lives better.
Great. It makes me think of sometimes you need something objective from the outside to neutralize the idea of role. So often when people think about designing for work, there is the idea of activity-based work, which is a schema that you go into and it mediates the interaction between the people. And maybe if we can't have a psychologist in the room, then we need a way to mediate that situation, and that might be an interesting thing to explore in the future. Thank you, Lucas, for the question. Marta.
Hi, Sam. Thank you for this conversation. I have a question about values. You've talked a lot about different aspects of personality, like being extroverted or introverted, or being tidy or untidy. And I wonder if you've how do you define values, and if you've explored that in the context of design? Because I was thinking about this. I could see myself applying that kind of one-on-one with residential clients. But then if I think about communities, like when you're designing for a community, and I always think about, well, I'm going to ask them about their values and try to represent these values in the space. What is a value? That's my question for you.
Yeah, I think this is an incredibly important question, and it actually points to one of the major deficiencies in my field, which is the fact that I've talked about personality, but personality has essentially been defined as personality traits, which is just one small element of personality. I'm very influenced by the psychologist Dan McAdams, who says that, look, personality traits like the big five, those sorts of those extroversion and those sorts of things, he says, look, they're fine, but it's essentially the psychology of the stranger. It's a good first read, superficial understanding on somebody. If you want to hire somebody to be, work as a receptionist versus a truck driver, then it's probably good to know their personality. But you're not really knowing much about them. You wouldn't want to marry somebody on the basis of their big five, their personality, their traits. For that, you need to get deeper. And I think, so things like values, like goals, like roles, those sorts of things are deeper, and I think are incredibly valuable. McAdams says you can go to a third level, even people, his identity, this kind of this sense of self, this narrative sense of who we are as a person, how you became, how the events of your life led to you becoming the person you are, and by implication, who you're going to be in the future. Those sorts of things have, I think, tremendous implications for design too. So the first thing is to say that I've collected a little bit of research. I have a measure that allows you to collect values pretty quickly, but I haven't integrated it into architectural design. But I think, to be honest, you're going to get even more traction with these deeper level kinds of dimensions like roles and goals and values and motives and those sorts of things. I know I'm a little bit of a broken record here, but when one of the buildings that Travis built, it was a seminary where he spent a lot of time trying to get the values of that organization and integrate at an organizational level, not a personal level, at an organizational level, and integrate those into the design process, and reported at least that he found that to be quite instructive in terms of the kinds of things he could put into the design. So the answer is, I haven't done it as far as I know. No one is really doing it, but I think it's tremendously promising area, more so probably even than personality traits, because those kinds of things are more malleable than personality traits.
Thank you.
Oops, we can't hear you, Itai.
Thank you. Thanks, Martha. Sarika, who is a past Lighthouse fellow as well. You're on mute.
I still can't hear anything.
Let's do this. We have another hand up, Jill. Sarika, have a go at fixing it. If not, you can type your question in the chat. No, my lip reading is really bad as well, so I just got a part of it. So write out your question so we don't miss it. And in the meantime, we'll go to Jill, who also has a hand up.
Thanks so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you. I have really enjoyed this conversation. And that question by Marta, hi Marta, anticipated my comment, which is, how do we translate this conversation into... Can you hear me? I'm getting a little bit of a feedback loop. It's okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
There's a bit of feedback loop, but I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, is how we translate this into group dynamics. And my interest in this body of work is in how it applies to museum design and the visitor experience in museums. And I've recently launched a research project with DLR Group, which B. Sanborn, who's on the call, was a partner in which we're looking to study the visitor experience, the arrival sequence, and the importance of spatial dynamics in influencing the visitor's sense of welcoming when they arrive. And so, of course, we're looking at spatial dynamics. And Sam, your three mechanisms, I think, are quite interesting and applicable, because the identity claims, I think, have a lot to do with the affordances, like how the welcome desk is positioned. And of course, historically, 100 years ago, museums were built with certain a sense of authority and awe, and so that is an identity. But the thought and feeling part, I think, has a lot to do with atmosphere, which we are studying, sort of the sensory environment. But the part that I'm interested in through the psychological one that you might comment on is, I've been reading about cultural memory and the idea of what people bring from their past experiences to the experience of museums. And of course, the challenge with museum visitation is the pluralism and the diversity of arrival. So, one can't design for a particular. And how you think about design in the context of inclusivity, I guess, is the question that I would have for you.
Yeah, I suppose. I think there. I mean, let's put it this way. I think that one of the kind of the quotes that has been most kind of meaningful to me is this is almost 100 years old, the Cluckholm and Murray quote about personality, where he says, in some ways we're like all other people, in some ways we're like some other people, and in some ways we're like no other people. And I think you can apply this to kind of some of those design ideas. So I think, in some ways there are things that some ways we're like all other people would be this universal idea of, there are some things that probably work for most people that need to be integrated into those ideas. And in some ways we're like some other people. So this might be where you kind of bring in some of that, the inclusivity elements of it. So, whether it's people from different cultures, different ages, different personalities, different type, various other different backgrounds, where you can kind of sort of, at least, which means, from a design and scientific perspective, at least having some kind of systematic, it directs you to have some kind of systematic understanding of what those things, what those different things might be. And then at the same time, also understanding that in some ways we're like no other people. In some ways, each person who walks through that door is going to have something that is also truly unique. In addition to having their part that is universal and is in some others, it's going to be in some ways like no others. Of course, the uniqueness doesn't mean you can't take it into account. So, for example, like I think, if I look at the living spaces I look at, no two living spaces are exactly alike. So they are all truly unique in some ways, but some of the mechanisms that lead to those differences might be similar. So, for example, most people in somewhere in their space have some kinds of reminders of special people, places, or times, or something like that. Now, of course, those individual items differ from person to person, so the uniqueness might be different. So just what I'm saying is, just because people are also unique, it doesn't mean you should give up your search to look for some kind of common mechanism. I suppose I only answered I don't think I'm not answered your question directly at all. At best, obliquely. Go ahead, sorry.
I think it's really helpful because the structure of our research is to look to see if there are patterns that emerge across 6 different museums that we're studying, to see if we're asking all the same questions. Are there some universal, or at least somewhat universal, even if they need to be customized to different places that do emerge from looking at this. So I think that's helpful. Thank you.
Sounds like fascinating research, though. Really, really interesting.
I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Jill. Sarika, how's the microphone situation?
I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. I think I got muted and then somehow something happened. Okay, great. I was trying to type in vigorously, but it's hard to kind of, such a pleasure to meet you, Sam. And my question is just, I'm hearing so many things. What I guide my clients through, and also I teach my students some of these methods are, definitely is something I called sort of designing and inhabiting the inner sanctuary. So it's more of, in a way that we already know this, what really resonates with us, what is our sanctuary, that, a body, we just feel like that when we inhabit it. So sometimes they draw from memory, places that really resonate, but then from memory, then I take them into imagination where they really inhabit this. but then my focus has always been as an architect to understand the design attributes. So light, shadow, materiality, multisensory, openness, enclosure, all of that. So my question is, from a lot of your research, it seems like when we look at someone's spaces, their living spaces, what we can pick up is more perhaps objects, personal items, pictures, maybe furniture, and maybe we can talk about style and what resonates, but we're getting to the fundamental as designers. How do we design these kinds of homes, sanctuaries for people that it is kind of what really resonates with them? So how do we, and this is perhaps linking into some of the neuroaesthetics research that Anjan Chatterjee's lab is doing, where they talk larger, like we are all, hominess, fascination, and coherence is we are all in some form or another. We all are hardwired to look for these attributes in spaces, of course, different people to see what we resonate with most based on kind of the aesthetic triad and all of these things, a lot of like our background and where we come from, because hominess and coherence can mean different things and fascination can mean different things. So kind of trying to tie all of this stuff back into sort of, as designers, what are the larger moves we can make? And I think core values is another thing I really delve into with the clients, and how do we actually then figure out ways to mediate core values through emotions, through like these larger attributes and not so much furniture or placement of furniture per se. So if you have any insights into how to tap into that, or even any kind of research on that.
To tap into which part of that?
So to tap into more of these larger spatial attributes that that get reflected in space beyond the kind of, whether you're tidy or not, or the kinds of the identity claims and the emotional kind of triggers, which could be more like decoration. So beyond that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what we have, the analysis we have done looking at, okay, well, how do we relate individual items to various traits and so on, that the links between those are much weaker than they are between these bigger, broader configural things, the kinds of things you're talking about. Even things like, is it colorful, rather than the individual colors, or, is it, even so, so I think I agree with you that it's these higher order, harder to measure dimensions, which is where the real value is. And the question is, I think there it does rely on the designer to be able to kind of implement what that means. As you said, for an individual, what is homey for one person might be quite different for somebody else, and what is fascinating for one person might be quite different. The way we did it in our original studies was trying to use human judges to kind of make evaluations of those broader dimensions. But as you say, the human judge themselves, is going to be influenced by their own, backgrounds and experience. In our most recent research, we've, had a certain amount of success using kind of, computer vision, AI perception to kind of, make these kind of higher level, broader judgments. Obviously, there's a lot of issues with that, including, what set of data go into training those models. But I guess I would say, my resistance to kind of using those higher level things has always been, how do you make it systematic? But I think these new tools, including the AI tools, allow us to have both these kind of configurable higher order things and do it in a systematic way.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Thank you, Soka. I'm glad the microphone worked. Monica, Monica, CCD veteran and head of operations.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for this talk. It was really interesting and it made me think a lot. I'm an architect and I've also been in the space of training. So my question to you is, can personality types change over time? And so I understand that I'm conscientious and agreeable and, you know, open-minded. So, or do people intrinsically sort of remain the same? And in that regard, so we as designers keep in mind these evolving sort of personality types, or can be designed for anticipating these behaviors? You know, can I become more open-minded in 10 years? I don't know. So that is my question.
Yeah, well, the personality change kind of literature is kind of interesting because it shows there's both a consistency and change. So there's normative changes. So essentially, you know, every person is more conscientious as a 25-year-old than they were as a 15-year-old, you know, and this is associated with the kinds of things we'd expect. So, you know, increase in frontal lobes, you know, mostly, but also cultural things too. You know, 25-year-olds have more responsibilities than 15-year-olds in many ways. So, there are normative changes, some of them quite big, especially in the dimension of neuroticism. You see big changes and you see big sex differences in those changes. So there are kind of systematic differences across the age range, but in general, your ranking stays about the same. Now, if even though, as let's say, we measure both you and Itai as 15-year-olds, you may be, more extroverted than Itai as 15-year-olds, even though you both become much more extroverted, more conscientious. You may be more conscientious than Itai as a 15-year-old, even though you'll both become more conscientious as 25-year-olds. You change quite a lot. The research shows on average your ranking stays about the same in terms of where you are within the general population. Now, of course, there are exceptions, as I think I can't remember, Itai mentioned, like in the context of therapy, like you can use therapy to change, and other events do change personality somewhat. But the general story is you have normative changes over age, but your general ranking relative to the population stays kind of the same.
Thank you.
We can't hear you, Itai.
Good questions, everyone. Thank you for all that. I had a feeling that it would bring up a lot of kind of musings and thinking about what we're doing and how we work and so on. So I'm super glad that, Sam, you could join us and have this conversation. And I think if we've done our job, then we're all going to leave with more questions than answers. And that's really the point of what we do at the CCD. And I do hope that this kind of brings a lot of inspiration and motivation for others to keep on questioning and keep on asking what we're doing and how we're doing it and how we can do it better. And we are privileged to have someone like you, Sam, to come and light the way for us in the Lighthouse. And thank you for your time. And thank you, everyone else, for joining. Until next time, I think the next event is a monthly mixer for the members and partners. There's an observatory event coming up where Luca, who is an observatory fellow, is gathering 3 different people, practitioners and researchers around co-imagination. And we hope to see you there. And we're really grateful that you've joined us and for your time. Thank you, Sam, again.
Thank you so much for having me. And please stay in touch, everyone. It's the networks really is how we're going to make progress through this network.
Thank you, everyone.